What does a contraction feel like? How do I know if I'm in labor? And what does the day of labor look like? Wait, is this normal? Hey, I'm Heidi. My best friends call me Hides. I'm a certified birth doula, host of this podcast, and author of Birth Story, an interactive pregnancy guidebook. I have supported hundreds of women through their labor and deliveries, and I believe every one of them and you deserves a microphone and a stage. So here we are. Listen each week to get answers to these tough questions. Birth Story, where we talk about pregnancy, labor, deliveries, where we tell our stories and share our feelings. And of course, chat about our favorite baby products and motherhood. And because I'm passionate about birth outcomes, you will hear from some of the top experts in labor and delivery. Whether you are pregnant, trying desperately to get pregnant, or you just love a good birth story, I hope you will stick around and be part of this birth story family. You guys, my book is out. It is out in the world. I cannot believe it. I have been writing it for several years, and it's just mind-blowing. Birth Story, Pregnancy Guidebook and Journal is a one-of-a-kind discovery into your pregnancy that provides you education through storytelling. So what's it really about? In the 16 years that I have served women with every personality type, I noticed there was a huge disconnect between what my clients were craving for childbirth education in a book and the books that were actually available on the market. There seemed to be unlimited resources if you are looking for an unmedicated birth or a natural birth or a home birth. But there just weren't a lot of resources for my clients who were part of the 92% of women birthing in a hospital and very much open to medical interventions like an epidural, nitrous oxide, and opioid medications. So I wrote that book to fill the gap for you. Week by week throughout your pregnancy, you will engage with material meant to educate and empower you as you plan for your own birth story. Hospital, medicated, unmedicated, or something in between. You are welcomed each week with a postcard from the womb, which is an adorable note from your baby about their miraculous development, as well as the amazing changes occurring within you. Then you are invited to use an uplifting birth affirmation and to respond to an introspective journaling prompt to document your feelings, curiosities, and wonders every single week. With room to memorialize your own birth story, this book will become a memory keeper and a legacy gift for your baby. You are encouraged to read one of my favorite birth stories each week, filled with childbirth education, tidbits, and explanations of important medical terms and procedures. These are real-life accounts shared with permission from the births that I've attended during my career as a doula. And I gave you a great mix. In the 42-week guide to your pregnancy and 42 birth stories, 7 of them end in cesarean section. About half are unmedicated and the other half are medicated deliveries. This is a judgment-free book. So take what you need from each element and leave the rest. Okay, are you ready to buy? I would love for you to go to birthstory.com and buy it directly from me. But I totally get it if you're an Amazon girl. You can head to amazon.com and just type in Birth Story Pregnancy, and the book should pop up. I'll deliver it straight to your doorstep. And I would venture to say that you might be an audiobook kind of woman because you're listening to a podcast. So if you would prefer to listen to this book, then I have recorded it and it is available for download at audible.com or on your Audible app. Thank you for being part of the Birth Story community. I am so excited for you to have this book in your hand once you've purchased it and it has arrived. I hope that you will give me your thoughts and feedback, and don't forget to take a selfie with your book and post it on Instagram and tag at Birth Story Podcast. All right. Welcome, Stacey, to the Birth Story Podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you, Heidi?
Oh, I'm really great. We're in the middle of the pandemic when we're recording, and it's the middle of the week. So I'll be honest, this is a really nice break for me to have left my children and come to the studio to record this. and I like went to Starbucks and I have coffee, and it's like my mom's babysitting. So I'm really looking forward to just having this time with you this morning. Stacey, tell
Me
us
too.
all about you.
Okay, well, I live about an hour from Starbucks, so I have not had any Starbucks today. I'm Stacey, and I usually say the middle of nowhere, Montana, because we farm and ranch, and we're an hour from town. And most of those miles are gravel roads. I am married to a farmer, and we met tailgating at a football game. We were both past college, but we still went to football games, and that's how we met. And we were married 9 months after we met. And we have 3 kids. My oldest will be 6 on Sunday, and he just started kindergarten this year. My second will be 4 in October, and my youngest is 3 months. And before I got married, I was a high school counselor. I call myself now a farmer's wife, and we raise wheat, mostly wheat, barley. We did chickpeas, lentils, flax this year, and we also have a pretty large cow-calf operation.
I love it. Well, those that have been listening to the podcast for a while know that my family and I vacation in Montana. My partner's family has a huge ranch in Montana also. And so it is our favorite place. It's our oasis. And during the pandemic, we actually drove from North Carolina to Montana. I recorded several episodes out there. And it was really nice to be able to drive from East Montana all the way to West Montana and to be able to see the entire state. It was really fantastic. I'm really excited to dig into these 3 beautiful birth stories. The first thing that I noticed, though, about your inquiry into the podcast was that you had had a hospital birth, then you had a birth center birth, then you had a side of the road birth. So this is going to be a really exciting podcast. But I had a question on, was home birth an option for you where you were located in Montana since it was so rural? Did you have any home birth midwives that would come to your farm?
The midwife that I used, she would have come to my house, which hindsight is 2020. I should have just planned on that for the third one. But we're just so far from town that it just made me a little bit nervous that if something would go wrong, that we would be, an hour from town, and we'd either need to get an ambulance out here or, I don't know, a helicopter from the hospital. So I just felt a little bit safer to be at the birth center, which is just a few miles from the hospital, if something did go unplanned.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I love home birth and I'm very passionate about home birth. And so I'm just always very curious about like what the dynamic is in different states and cities versus the one that I live in. So it would have been an option for where you are at in Montana. So that's really good to know. All right. Well, let's dig in. Let's go in chronological order. How about that? And then we'll get to this really exciting pickup truck birth. I just cannot wait to hear the details of it. But let's start with number 1. So you're pregnant for the first time and you plan to birth in a hospital. So tell me all about like getting pregnant, how your pregnancy was, and then how you decided to choose a hospital birth.
We got pregnant pretty quickly with our first. I can't really even say that it was planned, but it wasn't unplanned. So it wasn't that we were trying to get pregnant, but we were not trying to get pregnant. So we got pregnant really easily, and I had a really easy pregnancy. I hardly had any morning sickness. It all went well. When I got pregnant, I had never really even thought about being pregnant. So I hadn't really thought, I'd want to have a midwife or a hospital. And I'm just decided I'd call a OB, and I made an appointment to see an OB and just to do a hospital birth, just because I didn't really know anybody who had a birth center birth. So it just seemed natural to me, I guess, because I'd never thought about a birth center birth. And then around 32 weeks, I actually started having some preterm labor, and I ended up going to labor and delivery, where they gave me a shot to stop the contractions and sent me home. And then 2 days later, I ended up back at labor and delivery because it was happening again. And they gave me another shot to stop the contractions. And then they ended up having me come back, and I got 2 rounds of steroids to plump up the baby's lungs to make sure that if the baby was born early, that the lungs would be developed. And so that was a little bit scary just because it kept happening, and I wasn't really sure if I would go into labor early. And so then every week at my appointment with my OB, she would say, "Oh, I'll be surprised if I see you next week. You'll probably have your baby early." And every week went by, and we didn't know if we were having a boy or a girl. So every week went by, and I still was pregnant. And then I was almost to my due date, and I felt like that the day before I had him, it was the day before my due date or 2 days before. I started feeling like maybe I was having contractions, but it wasn't really significant. And my husband was really busy starting to seed winter wheat, which you plant in September, and then it grows over the winter and goes dormant and then actually grows again in the spring for anybody who's interested. So that's what he was doing. So I didn't want to tell him we were in labor if it wasn't really true because he was already stressed. And so I just kind of kept it to myself that day. And he came in the house about 9 o'clock that night. And I said, I think I might be in labor, but I don't know. And we don't have any self service where we live, like not even like a half a bar. It's like zero self service. And this was before we had radios for our operation. And so he said, "Well, why don't you come with me?" Because I knew if he went in the tractor, I would have no way of getting a hold of him. So I went with him at 10 o'clock that night, and we rode around seeding winter wheat until it got too uncomfortable for me to be sitting in the tractor bouncing around. So I went and sat in the pickup, and I tried to read a book, and about 45 minutes later, I was like, this is really happening. So I flashed the headlights on the pickup to signal to him to shut the tractor down, that we got to go. So he stopped the tractor. We went to the house. I took a shower and we drove to the hospital in town. It's about an hour drive, and the bumpy roads are really hard when you're starting to be in labor. I feel like it just makes it really uncomfortable. And my husband said he wanted to make sure I told you that I passed out while we were driving to town because it really scared him. I passed out across the center console, and I think I just was holding my breath and not breathing properly.
People don't know this. It is very normal to pass out in labor from holding your breath. We just, we're nervous or we're scared or we're feeling sensations we've never felt before. And our first
Right.
instinct is to close in and to, and so it's just really important to okay, push your shoulders back, take a deep breath, put your belly out and just keep breathing. And it's really
Right.
common to pass out during pushing too.
So we got to the hospital and checked into triage, and I passed out again while I was on the examining table. But then that didn't happen again. So I must have got my breathing under control. So we got a room, and it was probably 3 o'clock in the morning. And I think my water broke around 4 or 5 in the morning. And then I started pushing a little after 6 a.m. and I didn't have an epidural, and I pushed for a little around 2 hours, and he was born at 8:22 a.m. Everything was fine. And then we went home the next day, and my husband immediately went back to seeding winter wheat. That was my first birth.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I have a lot of questions about this birth before we get into the second one, but this is so cool. I mean, at 10 p.m., this is a relatively short labor. So at 10 p.m., you're riding around on the tractor, you're seeding, then you're still somewhat able to read a book in the pickup truck while you're waiting for your husband to finish working. And 8.5 hours later, you had a baby. That's
Yes.
pretty cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool. The gravel road, you said that almost the entire drive to the hospital is bumpy gravel road.
Yeah, it's about half. Yeah.
Oh, I can't
So
even
it's about 30
imagine.
miles of gravel and 25 of highway.
Oh, that would have been a long 30 minutes though, or 30 miles of gravel. I
Right.
mean, anyone listening to this podcast who has had a baby is cringing right now. We're like, oh, we know what you're talking
Right.
about. That would not have been fun. But honestly, a movement. I mean, I would think that it would sort of the tractor ride and then the gravel
Right.
probably really helped your child move down deep into your pelvis, with all of that
Right.
movement. So how cool. Looking back on your first birth, what is your favorite memory from that whole experience?
I just loved being pregnant. I know I hate to talk about that too much because I know some people have such hard pregnancies, but I just felt really good, and just, I don't know, it was pretty amazing, to be pregnant for the first time and feeling a baby move inside of you. And I felt good. And so it was just really fun, and seeing my belly get big, and just the whole experience was pretty, it just was really, and I will never forget, after we had our son, and I think part of me, I thought we would have a girl, and we had a boy. And I just remember what my husband told me afterwards. He was just like, he was so amazed with me. And he was like, he said, there's no way you can't not believe in God after watching someone give birth, because it's just such a miracle. And so that was really nice to hear. My husband was so proud of me that, giving birth. And so just the whole experience, honestly, was pretty amazing.
Okay, before we move on to the second birth, though, I was hoping that you may give a little bit of insight into preterm labor. So, for
Mhm.
anyone that's listening, like what the signs of preterm labor are and kind of what that instinct feels like to let you know something's not right here and I should go ahead and head to the hospital. So, could you just describe, like, for those first two preterm labors, what you experienced and how you knew when it was time to make a move to get help?
Yeah, so I had some Braxton Hicks, but before that, and so I remember I was sitting in church. It was a Sunday, and all of a sudden I started feeling I was having contractions, but they were happening consistently. And so I remember watching the clock on the wall at church and timing them. And that was how I really knew that it was something that I maybe should go in to get checked for, because they were consistent and I could time them, where with Braxton Hicks, they're erratic. And it probably helped too that my husband and I had done a birthing class, and we had just finished it like the month before. So all of this stuff was fresh in my mind about timing contractions and how far apart they are, and if they're lasting for close to a minute, or if they're more like 15 to 30 seconds, which is more like Braxton Hicks. And so these were like lasting 30 seconds, 45 seconds. So it wasn't full labor, obviously, but and so it also helped that my husband, his brother, one of his brothers is a doctor, and he happened to be visiting from Seattle at the time. And so I told him about it, and he's like, well, it probably wouldn't hurt to just go in and get checked. And he actually told me, he's like, I would check your cervix. He's like, but that might be kind of weird. So we didn't do that. And so I went to labor and delivery. So I would say for me, just the timing of them was kind of what tipped me off, that I was able to time them, that they were consistent, was what made me feel like I should go in.
I think that's really good advice. And so, if anyone's listening that is pregnant right now, it's normal to have Braxton Hicks. It's not normal to have consistent, timeable contractions before 37 weeks gestation. And especially some people will say, like, a back pain that comes and goes, right? The reason it's so important to get to the hospital or to call your midwife or go to the birth center, wherever you have chosen to birth, is because there are little interventions, like when they said they gave you an injection or an IV. And so just
Mhm.
giving a little bit of medicine, some IV fluids, rest can stop preterm labor with early interventions. And so I'm really glad that you were able to go both times. And then I will say this, in my experience with preterm labor, they typically will stop it one or two times, like they did in your case. But if
Mhm.
your body goes into preterm labor again, they typically do not stop it the third time. Some providers won't stop it a second time, but they typically don't
Mhm.
stop it the third time. And that is because we know that nature is smarter than medicine. And so
Right.
if your body is consistently trying to, deliver your baby early, it's because your body knows something that we don't know, meaning that your
Right.
baby is likely safer on the outside than it is on the inside. And so they'll usually stop those two times like they did for you. But that third time, they'll just keep you and try to keep you pregnant as long as possible before, delivery being imminent. So I'm so glad that you got to go home. And it is really interesting that you went all the way to 40 weeks, because common
Right.
misconception is that preterm labor leads to early baby. And I have had preterm labor clients that then had to be
Mhm.
induced at like 42 weeks.
Right.
Okay, I just wanted to touch on that because that was a really unique part of your story that other people need to hear. So let's talk about baby number two.
We got pregnant on the first month of trying, and So his birthday's September and then she was born in October. So 2 years apart. That was really easy. So I got pregnant easily and I had a really easy pregnancy. We did find out the sex. We found out we were having a girl. It was my idea to not find out the first time what we were having, and my husband was fine with that. But then he thought, well, we already have a boy. He's like, let's find out what we're having. So we found out we were having a girl the second time. And so then I didn't really know, with the preterm labor with the first was kept, at the back of my mind, like, is that going to happen again? And I actually really don't remember having very many, if at all, Braxton Hicks with her. So I got to 40 weeks and I'm trying to remember if I was even dilated at all by the time I got to 40 weeks, which was a really big difference from my first pregnancy, where I was dilated to a 3 from like 33 weeks on. And so that was really a big difference. And so I got to 40 weeks and nothing was happening. There was one time when I thought maybe I was going into labor. I started having a little bit of contractions, but then after a few hours, they stopped and didn't start back up again. So, the day before I was 41 weeks, I went in for a regular weekly with my midwife, decided to change to a birth center for the second pregnancy. I don't have anything really bad to say about the hospital. I had a good birth there. The only thing I didn't really like was I had planned on having a natural birth and not having an epidural. And I just kind of remember in the back of my mind, every time the nurse would come in, she would ask me if I wanted an epidural. And I said no, and I had told them no. And that just was kind of hard to keep getting asked that question when I had already made up my mind, which I realized they're just trying to do their job. And if I had changed my mind, but just didn't want to keep getting asked that question, I guess.
It's really interesting that you say that because I hear this all the time on the podcast, and this never happens with me because I think that when you walk into the hospital with a doula, I think it's just understood that your birth plan, that number one, you're going to have a birth plan and it's written and people are going to see it. But number two, if that birth plan says natural and you have an epidural, like they do not ask. Like I have never been at one single birth where they were like, honey, are you sure you don't want an epidural? I mean, probably because my job is to like advocate against that, But I think this is so important because like in this case, like you chose to go to a birth center and we're going to get in a little bit deeper into that decision. But for those that they don't have a birth center available or home birth's not an option and they are delivering at a hospital, if you want an unmedicated birth, put it in writing, make a birth plan. If you need a birth plan template, I've got one at birthstory.com. You can download it for free, but put it in writing, have your partner or, whoever you're birthing with, give it to the labor and delivery nurse. If there's a shift change, give it to the labor and delivery nurse and put on there, like, do not ask me for pain medicine, And I have found that with some friends that maybe I wasn't their doula, but some friends that were birthing and they had a good written birth plan, they didn't get disturbed out of that unmedicated rhythm. So I'm sorry I interrupted you, Stacey. I just wanted to say that. Continue on. Tell me all about more about that decision to birth at this birth center.
Maybe this is silly, but I really hate IVs. And when I was in labor with my first, I think it took them like 4 or 5 times to stick me to get the IV in. And I just remember, having contractions and being poked, and I hate needles. And so I knew if I went to the birth center, I had kind of done a little bit of looking at that when I was pregnant the second time or I guess not when I was pregnant, before I got pregnant, I kind of started thinking about that because I knew I wouldn't have to have an IV at the birth center. And I had already done a natural birth without an epidural. And so I knew that, or I thought I could do that again. And so I felt like, well, it just made sense to switch to the birth center. And I went when I was about 8 weeks pregnant. I went to the birth center and interviewed the midwife there. And we talked, and I didn't even really know what to ask her, but she said, well, what you should ask me is how many babies I've delivered and how many babies I've lost. And she said she had delivered over 3,000 babies and she had lost 0. So I just felt like it would be a good fit for me. There's like a bedroom basically where you deliver instead of a hospital bed, and there's a tub you could labor in. And it just felt like it would be a good fit for me. And I really liked every appointment. I always saw my midwife. It never was different doctor if my doctor was gone. And I knew that my midwife would be the one to deliver. Where at the hospital, I had seen my doctor for 9 months. And then when I went to deliver, she wasn't on call. So the doctor that delivered my baby was someone I had never even met before. So anyway, so my pregnancy, everything went well. 41 weeks. I told her, I was like, I am feeling like I'm really done being pregnant. I'm just really tired. And what can we do? So she gave me a quarter of a pill of Cytotec. And so that she doesn't use Pitocin. And so she gave me this pill and I put it under my tongue and went home. And then in the morning, we got up and I took another quarter of the pill on our way to town. And then when I got there, I think must have been dilated a little bit when we got there, like to a two maybe. But so she broke my water. And then she told us to go walk around town for a little bit and then come back when I felt like contractions were getting more uncomfortable. So we went to the park and we walked around for probably an hour. And at one point, I sat down on a park bench and I told my husband, I said, if I ever tell you I want to have another baby, remind me how much this hurts. And so that was when I knew we probably should go to the birth center. So we went back and I think I must have been dilated to like a 5 or a 6 by then. So I labored in the tub for probably a half an hour, 45 minutes before I just felt like that wasn't feeling good anymore. And so then I got up and kind of paced around the room a little bit. And then I remember just feeling really nervous or anxious about having to start pushing again because I pushed for 2 hours with my first. So I just like didn't even want to start pushing because I was scared I was going to have to push for that long again. And my midwife was like, you're not going to have to push that long. She's, was really encouraging. And so when we got to the birth center, it was 8 a.m. and she broke my water. And then at 11:30, I started pushing. And then my daughter was born at 11:45. So I pushed for about 15 minutes. And I just remember like telling her that I was scared, and she was like, it's not going to be that long. And, and it wasn't. And so I pushed for a few times. And then at the birth center, you don't spend the night. You just stay there for a few hours to make sure that the baby's doing okay and that you're okay. So we stayed there for a few hours and then we went home probably around 4 or 5 that afternoon.
Hey, it's Heidi. I'm interrupting the podcast to let you know about a free resource that I've created for you at birthstory.com. All you have to do is go to birthstory.com and then click the tab that says the workbook. Once you put your email address in, an entire resource library of all of my secret sauces are available to you for free as my thank you for listening to the Birth Story podcast and being part of this community. At birthstory.com, under the workbook, you will find a birth plan template, articles on circumcision, delayed cord clamping, flipping a breech baby, packing your hospital bag, acupressure points, placenta encapsulation, and so much more. There are over 20 free articles ready for you to download at birthstory.com. Now let's get back to this amazing episode. What an incredible birth. Stacey, 15 minutes of pushing. That's good. That's efficient is what it is. But this just so much speaks to birthing at a birth center and birthing with a midwife, right? Like, here are some things that we can do that are not continuous monitoring on Pitocin. Like with my clients, because I'm not a midwife, I recommend doing herbal inductions. So we do a lot of red raspberry leaf tea enemas and castor oil and blue cohosh, motherwort tinctures, like some different herbal things. The castor oil, I think that's kind of like really what puts everybody over the edge. But here you are like with this midwife and she's got this, this unique thing, which is just take a sprinkle of Cytotec, which is a pill that's a prostaglandin. It helps your uterus to contract. But then she sends you home. She doesn't keep you there for continuous monitoring. And then she breaks your water and she doesn't keep you there for continuous monitoring. She's like, go out in this beautiful October in Montana and walk around this park and then come back and have your baby. I mean, I'm jealous is what it is. What an incredible experience. So now you are a family of 4 with Two
Hmm.
pretty kick-ass birth stories. And were you planning to expand your family and have a bigger family?
We had talked about, we had gone back and forth on having a third, and there was one point where I was ready, I felt like, to have a third, and my husband said no. He said, we've got our hands full with two, because I was thinking of keeping them 2 years apart, all of them. And he, I think at that point, just felt like we were pretty, had our hands full, and kind of, I was really overwhelmed with two. And he said, I don't think right now is a good time. And so then a year later, maybe not quite a year, then I was feeling like, or he was then feeling like he wanted a third. And I had kind of felt like, I don't know if we should have a third, because I was feeling like we were in a rhythm with two kids. They were starting to be a little bit more independent. And I just didn't know if I wanted to go back again to having a baby. So then we both got on the same page and we started to try to get pregnant, and it didn't happen. And then I ended up actually, this was just last year. So I had to have knee surgery, and my doctor told me that if I was pregnant, he wouldn't be able to do the knee surgery. So we had to put off trying for a couple months. And then we tried for 3 more months to get pregnant, and we didn't get pregnant. And so I was feeling pretty discouraged, because I had gotten pregnant so easily with my first two that we kind of wondered maybe if it just wasn't meant to be. And we both agreed that since we already had two kids, we weren't going to do any like fertility treatments or anything. It was just, if it didn't happen, and it wasn't going to happen. And honestly, we basically stopped trying, and we hadn't talked about it. So August is when we do a lot of our harvest. And so we didn't even talk about it. We didn't even really try to get pregnant, because my husband was never home. And so then the next month we got pregnant, and we weren't trying. I wasn't tracking my cycle really anymore. I wasn't doing the ovulation sticks. And so it was a little bit of a surprise when we found out I was pregnant, because after months of trying and getting negative pregnancy tests, and then all of a sudden it was like, wow, how did this happen? So that was our third pregnancy. And so by that point, our kids were 3 and 5. Then it was kind of like, oh my gosh, we're really, it kind of felt like our kids were going to be more spaced apart than we had originally wanted them to be. So that was I was a little bit nervous about that, but it obviously worked out how it was supposed to.
Turns out to be a blessing, though, as you know now, when you have little older helpers.
Right. Yes, it is.
So you get pregnant, and it's,
Mm-hmm.
surprise-ish. And then tell me, did you have a relatively easy pregnancy again? Any signs of preterm labor this time?
This pregnancy, I felt like, was my hardest. With I was sick, the most sick I'd been with any of my kids, and it wasn't even really terrible. I don't like to complain about that, because I know some people have so much more morning sickness. But for about the first trimester, I was sick, which was different than my first two pregnancies. And we had decided for the third that since we already had a boy and a girl, that we wouldn't find out what we were having for the third pregnancy. And so I just felt a lot more sick the third time than I had the others. But then I didn't have any preterm labor. I did have a lot of Braxton Hicks.
When did the Braxton Hicks start?
Oh, with this pregnancy, I would say it was around 35 weeks, 35, 36 weeks. So I had Braxton Hicks from the end on. And having, already had two babies, and my first baby went to basically 40 weeks. My second pregnancy was 41 weeks, and I was induced with that pregnancy. So in the back of my mind, I figured I would go at least to my due date with this baby, or even past my due date. And so the day before I went into labor, my husband and we had gone out with the kids on our side by side, the ATV, to check crops. And so we were bumping around the fields, and I had an appointment that week on Tuesday, and I actually didn't have my midwife check me. She doesn't check you every time unless you ask to be checked. And I had her check me the week before, and I was dilated to a 3. And then I didn't have her check me that week. I was just feeling really uncomfortable and tired. And I just was thinking it wasn't going to do me any good to have her check me again, because it's kind of uncomfortable to be checked. And I thought it really didn't matter. I was only 38 weeks pregnant. So I thought I still had a few more weeks to go. So that night I couldn't sleep. I had a lot of insomnia, and So I sat in a chair the night before, and actually I was like on TikTok because I couldn't sleep. So I was watching TikTok videos, and I finally got into bed around midnight. And then around 5:30, I woke up and I felt like I was having maybe contractions, but I still was thinking it was just Braxton Hicks. But I did get out my phone and got out the contractions timer in my app and started timing them, and they were probably 5 to 6 minutes apart, but they weren't lasting, all of them, weren't lasting a full minute. And I wasn't in pain. And so I just felt like, well, I don't really know. And so at that point, I was 38 weeks and 5 days. And so I thought, there's no way that I'm really in labor because my none of my other pregnancies had gone that early. And so I got up at 6 and I told my husband, I might be having contractions, but I'm not really sure. And so he said, well, should I call my parents? And so his parents, we all farm and ranch together, but his parents live about 3 miles from us. And so he said, should I call my parents to tell them that they might need to watch the kids? And I said, no. I said, I don't really think I know that I'm in labor. So let's not get everyone excited. And I think in the back of my mind, I kept just thinking like how embarrassing it would be to not really know if I was in labor or not for my third pregnancy. Like, that I felt like I should just know for sure that I was in labor. And I just didn't have that feeling of knowing that I was for sure in labor. So the kids got up around 7 and asked me to make them pancakes. So I made pancakes, and partway through when I was cooking, I kind of was like, well, maybe I should get in the shower. So I had my husband come finish making breakfast, and I got in the shower and kind of, swayed around a little bit in the shower, but I still wasn't really in pain. And so I just kind of thought, well, we'll just kind of head to town sometime this morning
Did you
at
have
8.
any bloody show or like mucus?
No,
Nope.
no, I didn't. And this is like silly on my part because obviously my midwife does deliveries all times of day. But in my mind, I think I still was just like not sure I was in labor, but I felt like I should at least wait till 8 o'clock to call her because I thought it would be rude to call her before 8 a.m. And so at 8 o'clock, I called her, or no, it was like 8:15. I called her and I said, hey, I think that I might be in labor. I'm not really sure, but we're going to head to town. And so she said, well, how long does it take you to get to town? And I said, an hour. And she said, okay, I just want to make sure I have time to shower before I head to the birth center. And so I had actually hired a birth photographer, was supposed to come and do birth photos. And she had actually texted me the day before and just said, hey, I was just checking in. I was making sure if you're having any signs of labor. And I said, no signs of labor. I said, I don't think I'll have this baby anytime soon. So then that morning I texted her and I said, hey, funny story. I said, I might actually be in labor. We're headed to town. And she said, okay, I'll meet you at the birth center. So then I tried to call my mom, and my parents live out in Wyoming. They're about 6 hours away. And she didn't answer. She was at work. And I don't even know if I left her a message. And then, so at that point, I was really kind of feeling like maybe something was happening. And so I went to the bathroom and I sat down on the toilet, and nothing. And it was just like the sitting on the toilet. I just like it just was like a moment where I felt like, okay, this is really happening. Like, I remember calling for my kids. My husband was in the garage getting the pickup ready to go. And I called to the kids. I said, hey, go get your dad. And nobody answered me, of course. And so I yelled like a little bit louder. I was like, kids, go get your dad. And so they ran to the garage and got my husband. And I think he knew at that point it must really be happening because I was starting to, I yelled for him to come in the house. So I finished packing my bag for the birth center, which it was my third pregnancy. So I hadn't even finished packing my bag. And so I got everything packed and we got in the pickup. We left our house probably at 8:20 that morning. And it took about 5 minutes to get to my in-laws' house. And it had rained the night before. So the gravel roads were muddy roads. And so makes it a little bit more difficult. So I remember sitting on the edge of the front seat, holding onto the handle above my head as we were bumping along. And the kids, were asking if I was excited. And I wasn't talking because it was starting to get a little bit more painful. And so my husband said, your mom's excited, but she's also in a little bit of pain. And so it was still raining a little bit. So we get to my in-laws' house and we basically just opened the back door of the pickup and told the kids to go inside. And we didn't walk them in or anything. We just waved to them goodbye. And my husband looked down at the fuel gauge on the pickup and it wasn't there was enough gas to get to town, but just barely. And he said, should I put some gas in before we go? Because we have both fuel tanks in my in-laws' yard. And I remember I just was like, no, just go. Because at that point, I felt like things were really picking up. So we start driving, and so it was probably about 8:30 that we 8:35 that we left my in-laws' yard. And so at that point, we had 30 miles of gravel and about, it's kind of complicated, I guess. I don't know. So there's two different ways to get to town from our house. And so if you go from our house, it's less gravel and more highway. But if you go from my in-laws' house, it's more gravel and less highway. So it's about 30 miles of gravel and 15 miles of highway from their house. So we start driving, and I remember feeling like the contractions were really picking up, and I would turn around and I would face the back seat of the pickup and just wrap my arms around the back seat as I had the contractions. And I just kept telling my husband, I was like, I can't do this. It's so painful. And he was like, you can do it. I know you can. And so he kept driving, and the roads were muddy. And so then about 10 minutes later, I felt like and I can't remember now because it just happened so fast. I felt like if I needed to start pushing first, or if my water broke first, or if it happened at about the same time. But at 8:47, because I looked at the call log later on my cell phone, my husband called. Actually, I think he called through a little bit before that. He just said, hey, we're headed to town, and my wife, her labor is getting a little bit more intense. And so then she actually started to drive to meet us on the gravel road instead of meeting us at the birth center.
Wow,
And
like she knew that this was happening
yeah,
fast. Yeah.
yeah. So she started to drive to meet us. And so then at 8:47 is when we called her, because so all of a sudden my water broke as we're driving. So I soaked the front seat of the pickup, and I actually, which is kind of silly, I was wearing a romper, which is probably not the best thing to wear when you're in labor. But so I remember my husband was on the phone with her, and he was like, should she take her pants off? And so I took after my water broke and I was all wet, then I took the romper off. And I guess backing up, there was a point before my water broke when I remember I felt like I was starting to bleed. And so I like reached down, I could feel that felt that I was bleeding. And so that was the first sign of any blood, was when we were in the pickup. And then there was another point where I reached in and I actually could feel the baby's head, and it was probably a couple inches still up the birth canal. It wasn't coming out yet, but it was definitely, I could feel it. And so I told my husband that, and I think that's probably when he decided to call the midwife to tell her that, things were happening fast. So my water broke, and we kept driving. And then that's when I think I started pushing because my water broke. And so we had her on speakerphone for a while, but like I said, we don't have cell service. So the call kept getting dropped. And so then finally at 9:01, he got a hold of her again. And by some miracle, we were able to keep her on the line, and we kept driving, or he kept driving, and I was just kind of laboring, obviously, and pushing in the front seat. And then I remember feeling a really big push, and I pushed the head out. And I told my husband, I said, hey, the head is out. And so then he pulled over on the side of the road, and he climbed over into the passenger side of the pickup and got in front of me. And my midwife was on the phone, and she told me to get on all fours, but that just felt really awkward, like to be on all fours in the front seat of my pickup. And so my husband said, climb up get up on the console. So I scooched myself up and picked myself up and sat on the console of the pickup so that I had some space at least, for the head. And so he's got in front of me, and I felt like I had to push again. And I had one big push, and the baby came out, and he put the baby up on my chest. And then I sat back down in the seat, and the midwife, was on the phone still, and she asked if the baby was breathing. And honestly, that wasn't even on my mind at the time. It was just that immediate relief of I wasn't in pain anymore. And I just sat back and was just feeling good because I wasn't in pain anymore. And she looked a little bit blue. And so my midwife told me to rub her back vigorously. So I took my knuckles on her back, which at the time we didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. So I was rubbing my knuckles across her back, and she kind of made a little bit of noise. And so my midwife said, well, keep driving and I'll meet you. Which she had gotten lost in the meantime. She had not taken the right road. So she was lost.
Oh
But then,
no.
so then a few minutes later, we meet her on the road. She gets out and comes in and peeks in at us. And we had, like, we weren't planning for a roadside birth. And so we didn't have any towels or blankets or anything. So we had taken our coats and put them on top of the baby, and we cranked the heat up in the pickup as high as it would go. And so she pulled over and she just kind of opened the door and looked in and thought, that my bleeding was, I wasn't bleeding a lot still. And the baby looked okay. And so she said, well, I'll just meet you at the birth center. So then we drove the rest of the probably 15 miles to town. And at one point I said, well, should we look and see if it's a boy or a girl? And she was so covered in Bronec and like so slippery that I kind of remember trying to pick her up, and I just felt like, oh, I don't want to even try that. So I put her back on my chest. So we drove all the way to town and we still didn't know if it was the boy or a girl. So then I texted my birth photographer and I said, hey, I had the baby in the pickup. And she said, do you still want me to come to the birth center? And I said, sure. And so she came to the birth center. So then she actually was waiting there when we got there. So she took pictures as we got out of the pickup. And my placenta, I never felt like it didn't come out while we were driving. I kind of like, there was probably about 10 minutes while we were driving where I felt good. And then I started to feel a little bit uncomfortable, like contracting again. And then we got there and my midwife wrapped a blanket around me and the baby. And we walked into the birth center. And then I delivered the placenta and we found out we were having a girl. And then that was it. We stayed there for a few hours and went home.
Oh my, I'm like, I think I'm having this like physical reaction to your story, Stacey. I'm like, I'm sweating in anticipation, but then I've got like goosebumps, all over. But this whole time you're talking to at the end, I'm like where's her placenta? I'm like, where? I was thinking like you stood up and the birth photographer like caught your placenta like coming out of you.
Right.
So you made it because placenta is usually released within about 5 to 15 minutes. I mean, it can take up to 30 to 60 minutes, but like I would have assumed it would have released. So your placenta waited for you to at least get into the birth center. Wow. And so clearly your daughter is okay when babies are born that quickly, and they can come out a little blue because their lungs don't get squeezed, as much as they do if they're in the birth canal for a long time getting squeezed. And so that like vigorous rubbing can really help kind of perk them up and get them to kind of cough out some of that fluid that's in their lungs. Whoa, what a cool story. Oh my goodness. Do you have like the most incredible photos like from getting out of this pickup truck?
We do have some pretty cool photos. I put them on my website, but yeah, it was pretty. I mean, and everybody always asked us afterwards, like if I was scared or if I was freaked out. And to be honest, there wasn't any time like to be nervous. Like my body just took over, and I just was concentrating on that I was in labor. There was never. It's kind of weird now to think about. Like there was never a moment in my mind when I was like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have this baby in the pickup. It was just like I'm having this baby, and it didn't even really register that it might happen in the pickup. I think it maybe started to get a little bit more real for my husband when I, said I could feel the baby's head and that if we would make it to town or not. And he kept driving and trying to get us there, but we were just too far. And so basically, like when we left our house at 8:20, my best guess of when I had her, I think was about 9:05 or 9:06. And I had told him, and the only reason I know that is because after I had her and she was on my chest, I told my husband to take our picture. And so then I have the timestamp of our picture on my phone. So that was kind of how I guessed what time she was born.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's just so fascinating. But it's just a really good reminder to all of us too that there's this term that's like free birth, which is essentially what you had, like it was just you and your husband delivering your baby. But that like most of the time birth is not an emergency. It's just this natural thing that happens. Stacey, promise me if you have a fourth baby, you're going to have a home birth.
Right.
I'm like, I think the part of your story that made me the most nervous was the cell coverage gravel road problem. I was like, oh, how do we get her off the gravel road and get the cell phone to be working, and
Right.
all of these things. So you said at the birth center, right? You just go home within a few hours. So did they just deliver your placenta and you just chilled for a little bit and then went home?
Yeah, so we delivered the placenta and we didn't know what we wanted to name her. We had gone into the birth with a boy name and a girl name, but then the day of when I had her, then we kind of were, I think we just decided we didn't really like the girl name we had picked anymore. So we actually went home without her being named. But so I took a shower and they made us breakfast and just hung out there and let her breastfeed for a while. And then when I felt ready to go, I think we left around 1 o'clock, and we had gotten there at like 9:30. And then we went home, and the kids stayed at my in-laws' house for a few hours, and they brought them over at about 6 that night, just so we could kind of rest a little bit at our house. So it was all a pretty crazy day. From basically, I felt like I probably started going into labor at 5:30 that morning, and then had her a little after 9 that morning.
Oh, that is just, it is so crazy. Now tell me, what are the names of your 3 children?
My son is Rhett with an R, and then my second daughter is Allie, and then our baby is Nora.
Oh, what beautiful names.
Thank
What
you.
beautiful names. I love it. Those are great names. Wink, wink. Anyone who's listening who hasn't decided on their
Right.
names. Well, before we hang up, Stacey, I want you to share with the audience what your favorite baby product has been. I'll link it in the show notes so that if someone's building their registry right now, they can add your favorite baby product to their registry.
My favorite baby product, which I wish I had gotten with my first pregnancy, so if anyone is pregnant with their first, is a Solly baby wrap. And I actually was hesitant to my first pregnancy. It looked daunting and overwhelming to try and wrap a baby. Like that seemed like something I wouldn't be able to do. So I just didn't even get one because I thought there's no way I'll be able to do this. But my third pregnancy, or my third time I had this baby, I got her wrap, the Solly baby wrap. And it's been really amazing, especially with having 2 other kids, that I can wrap her up and she'll take a nap in it. And so it was really helpful, especially the first 2 months when she just wanted to be held all the time. So I would definitely recommend a wrap to a first time mom, second or third.
Awesome. Me too. They are so, so soft. So we will link to the Solly baby wrap in the show notes. And then Stacey, would you be open to the audience reaching out to you if they have any questions about your births or birthing at a birth center in Montana?
Sure, of course.
Cool. How do we get a hold of you?
My Instagram is at Stacey Bronec. So it's STACY, B as in boy, RON as in Nancy, EC. Or you can find me on my website at stacybronec.com.
Thank you, Stacey. It's been an incredible morning just sharing your stories and learning all about them. I was really excited for this episode because we've just got that link with Montana. And of course, hearing about anyone delivering in a pickup truck was just really fascinating. I loved learning from you, especially about preterm labor. And I hope that our audience will connect with you. Thank you for reaching out and for being on the Birth Story podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Birth Story. My goal is you will walk away from each episode with a clear picture of how labor and delivery might go, and that you will feel empowered by the end of your pregnancy to speak up, plan, and prepare for the birth you want.